In the shadowed hollows of early American history, where the official record falls silent, there exist stories etched only in folklore and fear. These are the accounts of lives that unfolded at the frayed edges of civilization, tales of desperation that curdled into something monstrous under the pressures of isolation and want. This is one such account from the year 1841, a chronicle of a remote New England valley, a solitary widow named Eunice Ransom, and a dark trade that has been whispered about for generations. It is a story that suggests the deepest darkness is not found in the wild woods, but in the quiet, desperate corners of the human heart, where survival demands an unspeakable price. If the spectral echoes of the past are what you seek, and you have only just found this archive, subscribe now to join our vigil and ensure no story is ever truly lost. The Connecticut River Valley, in the unforgiving winter of 1841, was a landscape sculpted by hardship. It was a place of stark and brutal beauty, where the land itself seemed to enforce a doctrine of grim endurance. The rolling hills, which in summer were a gentle green, now lay buried under a thick shroud of snow, their contours softened into a vast, undulating whiteness that swallowed sound and stretched to a horizon of bruised, pewter-colored clouds. The river, the valley's very lifeblood, was choked with ice, its powerful current stilled into a jagged, frozen scar that ran the length of the region. For the small, scattered farming communities that clung to its banks, this was the season of contraction, a time when the world shrank to the dimensions of a single room, a hearth, and the dwindling stores in the root cellar. Poverty was not an event here. It was the atmosphere. It was a constant, low-grade fever that informed every decision, from the mending of a threadbare coat to the rationing of firewood. The soil was thin and rocky, yielding its harvests only through back-breaking labor, and the winters were long and merciless, a yearly siege that tested the faith and fortitude of even the most devout. The people were a reflection of the land, resilient, insular, and deeply suspicious of anything that deviated from the established rhythms of toil and worship. Their lives were governed by the rising of the sun, the turning of the seasons, and the unyielding moral calculus of the parish church. It was a world of sharp, unforgiving dualities, of salvation and damnation, of neighborly duty and silent, simmering judgment. Along a desolate stretch of the post road that traced the frozen river, stood a structure that seemed to have absorbed the very essence of the valley's gloom. It was a tavern, though the faded sign that creaked mournfully on its iron bracket was barely legible, its paint peeled away by years of relentless wind and sleet. The building slumped like a tired old man, its roofline sagging in the middle, its clapboard siding weathered to the color of bone. This was the property of Eunice Ransom, and it was her entire world. She had come into its ownership not through ambition, but through loss. Her husband, a man whose presence had once filled the small public room with a semblance of coarse vitality, had been taken by a sudden lung fever 2 winters prior, leaving Eunice a widow at the age of 39. In an instant, she was thrust into a position of precarious solitude, a woman alone in a world built for and by men. The community had watched, expecting her to fail. They anticipated the tavern would be sold for a pittance, its contents auctioned off, and Eunice herself reduced to living on the charity of the parish, a grim and common fate for widows of her station. But she had not failed. Instead, she had held on, operating the roadside establishment with a quiet, unnerving tenacity that defied all expectation. The tavern under Eunice's sole proprietorship was a place stripped of all cheer. It offered travelers and a few local laborers little more than shelter from the biting wind and a measure of cheap, searing rum. The public room was small and perpetually dim, illuminated by the hesitant flicker of tallow candles that did more to animate the shadows than to dispel them. The air was thick with the cloying, sweet smell of rum, mingled with the damp, earthy scent of the packed dirt floor and the acrid smoke from a hearth that never seemed to produce enough heat. Frost etched delicate, fern-like patterns across the grime on the window panes, glazing the outside world into a distorted, milky blur. Eunice moved through this cheerless space with a spectral grace, a silent figure in a homespun dress of indeterminate gray. She was a gaunt woman, her face a pale oval in the gloom, her features sharpened by a sparseness that went beyond mere thinness. It was as if she were slowly being whittled away by the harshness of her existence. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly that it seemed to strain at her temples, and her eyes, deep-set and watchful, rarely met those of her patrons. She would pour the rum from a heavy stoneware jug into cracked pewter mugs, her movements economical and precise, her silence a wall that discouraged conversation. For a woman who had known a different life, one of shared burdens and modest comforts, this solitary vigil was a profound alteration. The only hint of her former self lay in a small, almost unconscious habit. Before placing a mug on the rough-hewn counter, she would wipe its rim with a clean cloth, a small gesture of domestic order in a place that otherwise felt on the verge of succumbing to decay. It was a detail few noticed, but it spoke of a life that had once held the promise of something more than this. It was this very survival, this stubborn persistence against the odds, that first planted the seeds of suspicion in the community. In a season when even the most prosperous farmers were tightening their belts, when coin was scarce and trade was reduced to barter, Eunice's tavern seemed mysteriously immune to the prevailing hardship. The central puzzle was the rum. Caribbean rum, even of the cheapest and rawest quality, was not a local product. It had to be brought upriver, purchased from traders, and paid for with hard currency or goods of equivalent value. Eunice, a widow presumed to be destitute, had no visible source of income beyond the meager pennies she collected from the sale of that very same rum. Yet, the supply never faltered. The heavy stoneware jug was always refilled. This simple, inexplicable fact became a source of endless, whispered speculation. The talk began in the pews after Sunday service, in the hushed conversations between wives over a shared quilting frame, and in the sidelong glances exchanged between men at the grist mill. They spoke of how Eunice had changed since her husband's passing. It was not just her gaunt appearance, but a certain unknowable quality that seemed to cling to her like the river fog. They remarked upon her solitude, how she never sought company or comfort from her neighbors, how she seemed to exist in a world entirely of her own making. The women of the parish, who had initially approached her with offers of food and solace, had been met with a polite but impenetrable reserve that quickly discouraged further attempts. She asked for nothing and, it seemed, wanted nothing from them. This quiet, simmering unease began to curdle into something darker with the sightings. Children, solitary and small, were occasionally seen in the vicinity of the tavern. This, in itself, was not entirely unusual. The poor of the parish were often forced to send their children to work or to seek assistance where they could, but the children seen near Eunice's property were different. They were transient, almost ghostly figures, glimpsed for a day or two and then gone. A farmhand, making his way home at dusk, reported seeing a small boy, no older than 7, drawing water from Eunice's well. The boy was thin, dressed in clothes that were little more than rags, and he worked the heavy bucket with a solemn, weary determination. The farmhand had called out a greeting, but the boy had only stared back with wide, empty eyes before scurrying into the tavern's darkened doorway. A week later, the farmhand asked around, but no one in the surrounding area could claim the child. It was as if he had materialized out of the winter mist, and then vanished back into it. On another occasion, a pair of sisters walking to the meeting house saw a young girl standing in the tavern's yard, her face pressed against the cold glass of a window. They knew her to be one of the Pike children, a family left destitute after their father had perished in a logging accident. The girl's name was mentioned in concerned whispers, but when inquiries were made, the rest of her family had been sent to a neighboring town to live with distant relatives, and her own whereabouts were uncertain. These were not happy, well-fed children playing in the snow. They were forlorn specters, their brief appearances marked by a profound and unsettling silence. The very idea of a child within the grim, dilapidated walls of that rum-soaked tavern felt deeply incongruous, a note of discord that resonated with a primal sense of wrongness. Observing all of this with the meticulous and dispassionate eye of a man accustomed to keeping records was Josiah Brewer, the parish clerk. Josiah was a man whose life was defined by order and documentation. His hands, though calloused from the demands of his own small farm, were most at home holding a quill, his mind most at ease when translating the messy affairs of the community into the neat, spidery script of his ledgers. He recorded births, deaths, marriages, and property transactions, his entries providing the official framework upon which the town's history was built. He was not a man given to idle gossip or flights of fancy. His currency was fact, and it was the troubling lack of factual explanation for the events surrounding Eunice Ransom's tavern that had captured his attention. He had seen the children himself. He had seen the orphan boy, Samuel Pike, a sullen and perpetually hungry child who had been a ward of the parish, loitering near the tavern's back door. Josiah had made a mental note to speak with the deacon about finding a more suitable placement for the boy, but when he went to do so a few days later, Samuel was gone. No one had seen him leave. No one knew where he had gone. He had simply been absorbed into the great, indifferent silence of the valley. Josiah did not speak of his growing concerns openly. Instead, he began a private record, a document separate from his official duties. On a loose sheet of foolscap, hidden within the pages of a heavy, leather-bound book of town accounts, he made his first entry. It was a simple notation, the name Samuel Pike, followed by the date he was last seen. He described the boy's approximate age and his connection to the parish. Beside it, he wrote a single, stark observation: last seen near the widow Ransom's tavern. The transition from hushed gossip to a more defined and terrible fear was gradual, an imperceptible shift in the local consciousness. The unease was no longer a vague suspicion about a widow's improbable solvency. It was beginning to coalesce around a new and horrifying focal point: the quiet, steady disappearance of the region's most vulnerable. The children who vanished were not from prominent families, whose absence would trigger an immediate and forceful inquiry. They were the forgotten ones, the children of itinerant farmhands, the orphans of the parish, the offspring of families so crushed by poverty that their comings and goings were often overlooked. They were the children who lived in the margins, whose presence was so faint that their absence was easily dismissed or explained away. They were said to have been sent to live with relatives in a distant county, or to have been taken on as apprentices by passing tradesmen. These explanations were accepted because they were convenient, because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. Yet, the pattern was becoming undeniable, a dark thread running through the fabric of the community. And at the center of this pattern, like a spider in the heart of a web, sat the silent, gaunt figure of Eunice Ransom and her lonely tavern on the desolate post road, where the rum flowed without explanation and where the faintest, most vulnerable footsteps always seemed to lead, before ending abruptly at her door. The question of how a destitute widow kept her tavern running was slowly being replaced by a far more terrifying one, a question that no one yet dared to ask aloud. The deep winter tightened its grip, and the initial whispers of suspicion surrounding Eunice Ransom's tavern began to harden into a brittle, unspoken dread. Fear, in such a small and isolated community, did not announce itself with loud proclamations. It seeped into the spaces between people, a chilling draft in the warmth of a neighbor's kitchen, a sudden silence in the middle of a shared prayer. It was a fear that was nurtured by the relentless monotony of the season, by the endless expanse of white snow that seemed to erase all tracks, all histories, all hope of finding what was lost. The landscape itself became an accomplice to the disappearances, its blank and silent face offering no clues, no comfort. The world felt ancient and indifferent, a place where a small life could be extinguished as easily as a candle flame in a sudden gust of wind, leaving behind only a brief, fading wisp of smoke and the memory of light. The pattern of vanishings, once a subtle and disjointed series of unfortunate events, began to reveal itself as a coherent and terrifying narrative, its chapters written in the small, hesitant footprints that led in one direction only, toward the sagging porch and the perpetually closed door of the widow's tavern. The first thread in this dark tapestry was the story of a young girl named Ada. She was the daughter of a tenant farmer who worked a small, unprofitable plot of land a few miles downriver from the tavern. Her family lived in a state of perpetual struggle, their existence a constant calculation of meager resources against overwhelming need. Ada was a quiet child of 8, with hair the color of dried corn silk and a disposition so solemn it seemed she had been born with the weight of her family's hardship already settled upon her small shoulders. Her one small duty, which she performed with a seriousness that belied her age, was the weekly delivery of a small basket of eggs to Eunice Ransom's tavern, one of the few places that would trade for them with a bit of flour or salt pork. It was a transaction of the poor, a small exchange of sustenance that kept 2 households from the brink. One brittle February afternoon, as a low sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the snow, Ada pulled on her worn woolen coat, a garment patched in so many places its original color was a matter of speculation, and set out with her basket. Her father watched her from the doorway of their cabin, a small figure receding into the vast blue-white landscape, her small footprints the only mark of her passage. He had told her to hurry back before the early dusk settled, but dusk came, and then full, star-pricked darkness, and Ada did not return. The farmer's search began as a flicker of paternal anxiety and grew, with each passing hour, into a raging fire of panic. He walked the path to the tavern, his boots crunching in the crystalline snow, calling her name until his voice was a raw, hoarse whisper swallowed by the immense silence of the woods. He reached the tavern, a dark and hulking shape against the snow, and saw no lights in the windows. He banged on the door, his fists numb with cold, but received no answer. The next morning, a small party of neighbors joined him, their faces grim, their movements heavy with a shared, unspoken foreboding. They followed the tracks. It was a simple, heartbreaking trail. The small, shallow impressions of Ada's worn boots were clear in the day-old snow, a straight and determined line from her family's cabin to the edge of the tavern property. There, at the foot of the 3 stone steps leading to the door, they stopped. There were no other tracks, no sign of a struggle, no scuffed snow, no second set of prints leading away. It was as if the child had walked to that exact spot and been lifted from the earth, erased from the world. When they finally roused Eunice, she appeared in the doorway, a spectral figure wrapped in a shawl, her face pale and impassive in the cold morning light. She told them the child had never arrived. She said she had been waiting for the eggs, but the girl had not come. Her denial was flat, absolute, and delivered with an unnerving lack of emotion. The men looked from her stony face to the footprints in the snow, a clear and damning contradiction, and a cold dread settled in their hearts. The child was gone, and the snow told a story that the widow refused to acknowledge. The disappearance of 2 more children a month later transformed this creeping dread into a sickness of the soul for the entire parish. They were brothers, orphans who had been taken in by a distant cousin after their parents succumbed to influenza the previous winter. The oldest was Thomas, aged 10, and the younger was Caleb, who was 7. They were inseparable, a pair of feral, wary boys who clung to each other as their only fixed point in a world that had offered them nothing but loss. Their cousin, a man burdened with too many children of his own and too little food to go around, was not unkind, but his charity was stretched thin. The boys were often left to fend for themselves, their hunger a constant, gnawing ache. One afternoon, they were seen by a woman gathering firewood on the edge of the village. She watched them walking along the post road in the direction of the Ransom Tavern, their shoulders hunched against the wind, their faces pinched with cold. She later reported that she had felt a pang of pity, but had done nothing, assuming they were on some errand. It was the last time anyone saw them. Days later, when their absence had become too prolonged to ignore, the deacon of the parish, Amos Witt, made a formal inquiry. Deacon Witt was a man who valued order above all else. He saw the community as a clockwork mechanism, and any disruption to its predictable, steady ticking was a source of profound irritation. He was a man of firm handshakes and stern pronouncements, but he possessed little appetite for plumbing the darker depths of human nature. He questioned Eunice Ransom himself, standing on her porch with 2 of his elders, the picture of ecclesiastical authority. He said he had been told 2 boys were seen near her establishment. Eunice's response was the same as before. She claimed she knew nothing. She stated that vagrant children often passed on the road, but none had come to her door. She was, she insisted, a solitary widow who kept to herself. Her performance was one of weary, put-upon innocence, and Deacon Witt, a man predisposed to accept the simplest explanation, seemed inclined to believe her. He found it easier to imagine 2 desperate orphans had simply run away, seeking a better life in a larger town, than to confront the monstrous possibility her placid denial concealed. But Josiah Brewer could not accept it. The parish clerk, in the quiet solitude of his small, book-lined study, felt the weight of these disappearances as a personal, moral burden. While Deacon Witt was busy restoring the appearance of order, Josiah was consumed with the evidence of its utter collapse. The stories of the missing children were not abstract reports to him. They were ghosts that haunted his waking hours. He could see Ada's small footprints in the snow, a trail that led to a horrifying void. He could picture the 2 orphan brothers, their hands clasped together for comfort, walking toward a fate they could not comprehend. His official ledgers, with their neat columns and balanced accounts, seemed a grotesque mockery of the truth. The real record of the town's life, he now believed, was not in its registered deeds or sanctioned marriages, but in the growing list of names he kept on the loose sheet of foolscap. He retrieved it from its hiding place, the paper growing soft and frayed at the edges from his repeated handling. He dipped his quill in the ink pot, the small, scratching sound loud in the stillness of the room. Beneath the name of Samuel Pike, he added another, Ada, daughter of the farmer downriver, with the date of her vanishing. And beneath hers, he wrote the names of the 2 brothers, Thomas and Caleb, noting their status as orphans of the parish. He recorded the testimony of the woman who had seen them last, his hand moving with a slow, deliberate precision, as if the act of writing could impose some kind of order on the chaos, some measure of justice in the face of an unspeakable crime. As he wrote, he felt a profound sense of isolation. He knew that to voice his suspicions openly, to accuse the widow Ransom without definitive proof, would be to invite scorn and scandal. It would pit him against the authority of Deacon Witt and the community's deep-seated desire to believe in its own wholesomeness. An accusation of this magnitude was a contagion, and no one wanted to be tainted by it. They preferred the comfort of a simple, if tragic, explanation. They would rather believe the children had run away or succumbed to the perils of the wilderness than to accept that a monster was living in their midst. Josiah's private ledger was more than just a list of names. It was a testament to a truth that everyone else was trying to ignore. He sat for a long time at his desk, staring at the names, each one representing a life cut short, a future stolen. The core question burned in his mind, no longer a vague whisper but a deafening shout. What was Eunice doing with them? The tavern, he knew, was the nexus. The unexplained supply of rum and the unexplained disappearance of children were two halves of the same terrible equation. There was a commerce at play, a dark and unholy barter that was sustaining the widow's unlikely enterprise. He had no proof, not yet, but his clerk's mind, so adept at following the logic of accounts and transactions, was beginning to perceive the outlines of an appalling ledger, one where the currency was not coin, but the lives of the innocent. It was a trade conducted in the shadows, at the edge of the frozen river, where strange barrels were unloaded in the dead of night, and the cost was measured in the silence where a child's laughter used to be. The Connecticut River in its winter slumber was a place of secrets. By day, it was a vast and desolate artery of ice, but by night, under the cold and distant gaze of the moon, it transformed. It became a liminal space, a shadowy frontier that separated the settled, God-fearing world of the parish from the untamed wilderness and the transient, lawless lives of the men who plied its waters. When the ice began to break in the late winter thaws, creating treacherous channels of black, churning water, the first of the shallow draft riverboats would appear, poled and dragged through the slush, their crews eager to resume the trade that was their lifeblood. These were hard men, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their hands calloused from rope and oar. They belonged to the river, not to the land, and they moved through the valley's small communities like ghosts, their business conducted quickly, often in the dead of night. Their loyalties belonging only to profit, they brought salt, iron goods, and, most importantly, the raw, potent rum of the Caribbean, trading it for the furs and timber that the valley produced. They were men who knew how to be discreet, who understood that not all transactions were fit for the light of day. It was in the darkest hours of these thawing nights that the true nature of Eunice Ransom's enterprise began to reveal itself, not through gossip, but through the fragmented accounts of reluctant witnesses. A trapper, checking his lines along the riverbank long after midnight, saw a lantern bobbing in the thick mist that rose from the water. He concealed himself in a stand of snow-laden hemlocks, his curiosity piqued. He watched as a small skiff, manned by a single broad-shouldered figure, detached itself from a larger keelboat moored in the main channel. The skiff moved silently toward a secluded cove not far from the Ransom Tavern. There, a second lantern was waiting. The trapper saw a thin, solitary figure, whom he recognized even from a distance as the widow, Eunice. What followed was a transaction of unnerving silence and efficiency. Eunice guided the riverman to several large barrels, half hidden in the undergrowth. With practiced movements, they rolled the heavy casks down the muddy bank and into the skiff. The exchange was what held the trapper's attention. No coin changed hands. Instead, the riverman, Elias Cord, a trader known for his taciturn nature and the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, lifted two heavy, canvas-wrapped bundles from his boat and placed them on the ground at Eunice's feet. The bundles were not large, but they were dense and oddly shaped, and Elias handled them with a peculiar mixture of roughness and care. The entire exchange took less time than it would take for a church bell to toll the hour. The skiff then retreated back into the fog, a silent vessel being swallowed by the night, and Eunice, after a long moment of stillness, dragged the two bundles, one by one, up the path toward her tavern. The trapper did not understand what he had seen, but the image of the silent barter, the heavy barrels for the small, dense bundles, etched itself into his mind with the chilling clarity of a nightmare. This clandestine trade left a more tangible form of evidence piling up in the daylight world behind Eunice's barn. Through the long winter, the stack had grown steadily, a silent testament to a commerce that had no logical explanation. It was a boneyard of empty rum casks. They lay on their sides in the muddy snow, a small mountain of weathered oak and rusted iron hoops. Any farmer or tradesman in the valley knew the cost of such a collection. A single cask of rum represented a significant expenditure, far beyond the means of a widow running a failing tavern. To have accumulated more than a dozen of them was an impossibility. It suggested a volume of trade that would rival the most prosperous merchants in the larger towns downriver. Yet, there were no records of such transactions. Eunice paid her property tithes with the same meager collection of coins as always. She bought her flour and salt in small, carefully measured quantities. There was no sign of wealth, no sudden influx of cash that could account for the sheer quantity of liquor that had clearly passed through her establishment. The empty casks were a glaring contradiction, a physical manifestation of the lie she was living. They spoke of a secret and profitable partnership with the rivermen, a trade conducted in a currency that left no mark on any official ledger. They reeked of the sweet, heavy scent of rum, an odor that seemed to have permanently saturated the wood, but to those who looked upon them with growing suspicion, they smelled of something far more sinister, a dark and terrible secret kept in the perpetual gloom of the tavern's cellar. The final, horrifying piece of the puzzle was provided by a man named Nathan Holt. Nathan was the ferryman, a fixture in the community, a man whose entire life was measured in the slow, rhythmic crossings of the river. He was a practical man, not given to flights of imagination. His world was one of currents and sandbars, of the strain on his ropes and the balance of his flat-bottomed ferry. He knew the river's every mood, its every sound. His humanizing grace was his intimate, almost paternal relationship with his vessel. He could discern a shift in the wind by the particular way the wood groaned beneath his feet. One evening, as a heavy, wet snow began to fall, obscuring the banks in a swirling curtain of white, Elias Cord, the river trader, hired him for a special crossing. He had cargo he needed to move to the far side of the river, where a wagon was waiting. The cargo consisted of 3 large, tightly sealed barrels, identical to the ones that were now rotting behind Eunice Ransom's barn. Nathan, with his usual brusque efficiency, helped Elias roll them aboard. They were heavy, unnervingly so, and as he was securing the last one with a length of thick rope, he heard a sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible beneath the sighing of the wind and the lapping of the black water against the hull. It was a soft, muffled cry, a sound of distress that was cut short, as if smothered by a heavy blanket. Nathan froze, his hands still on the barrel. He told Elias he thought he had heard something. The trader, his face a mask of indifference in the swaying lantern light, merely grunted and said it was likely a cat trapped in the hold of his boat. He told Nathan to mind his business and get them across the river. But Nathan had heard the sound again, a brief, desperate scratching from within the barrel he was touching. It was not the sound of a cat. It was a small, distinctly human sound. A profound and chilling certainty washed over him, a truth so monstrous that his mind recoiled from it. He said nothing more. He pulled the ferry across the churning water, his back to the trader, his knuckles white where he gripped the wood. The weight of the barrels felt different now. It felt like the weight of a sin for which there was no name. When Nathan reported what he had heard, he did not shout it in the public square. He went, under the cover of the following night, to the home of Josiah Brewer. In the quiet of the parish clerk's study, with the door bolted and the shutters drawn, the ferryman recounted the events of the crossing. He spoke in a low, halting voice, the words torn from him with visible effort. He described the weight of the barrels, the muffled cry, the scratching from within. He spoke as a man unburdening himself of a piece of knowledge that was too terrible to carry alone. Josiah listened, his quill poised motionless over his private ledger. He did not interrupt. He let the ferryman's words fill the silent room, each one a hammer blow against the community's willful ignorance. When Nathan had finished, Josiah finally dipped his quill in the ink and began to write. He recorded the ferryman's testimony with painstaking detail, his neat script a stark contrast to the chaotic horror of the account. The smuggling intrigue had dissolved, replaced by a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the winter earth. The question was no longer if Eunice was trading something for the rum that sustained her. The testimony of the ferryman, a man whose honesty was as solid as the riverbed itself, provided the horrific answer. The whispers of suspicion had reached a breaking point. The fragmented evidence, the empty casks, and the ferryman's chilling report had now converged into a single, undeniable accusation. The time for quiet observation and private record-keeping was over. The truth, however monstrous, had to be confronted. The community, which had for so long averted its gaze, would now be forced to look into the abyss that had opened up in its very midst. The ferryman's story was the spark that ignited the dry tinder of the community's fear. It could not be dismissed as the rambling of a drunkard or the malicious gossip of a resentful neighbor. Nathan Holt was a man of the river, as steady and reliable as its current, and his word carried the weight of undisputed fact. His account spread not like a wildfire, but like a rising tide of black water, cold and inexorable, reaching every homestead and filling every heart with a dread that could no longer be ignored. The private terror of a few grieving families became the public burden of the entire parish. The specter of what was happening in their midst was too large to be contained by silence, and the pressure for an official reckoning became unbearable. It was Josiah Brewer who finally forced the issue, presenting his private ledger not as a collection of suspicions, but as a formal record of a plague that had befallen their children, demanding that Deacon Amos Witt convene an immediate and public inquiry. The deacon, a man who loathed public disorder more than he feared private sin, could no longer defer. A meeting was called, a summons that felt less like an invitation to civic discourse and more like a conscription for a war against an unknown evil. The town's meeting hall, a stark and cavernous building that smelled perpetually of damp wool and old wood smoke, was lit by the unsteady, greasy light of a dozen whale oil lamps. They cast a jaundiced, flickering glow that seemed to cling to the rough-hewn wooden beams of the ceiling, leaving the corners and the high rafters steeped in impenetrable shadow. The air was thick and close, heavy with the breath of the assembled parish, each person a silhouette of anxiety. They sat packed together on the hard, backless benches, their faces pale and serious in the wavering light, a sea of grim expressions. This was not a gathering of neighbors. It was a convocation of witnesses, each carrying their own piece of the terrifying puzzle. They whispered amongst themselves in low, urgent tones, the sound a continuous, sibilant hum that rose and fell like the wind outside. At the front of the hall, a long table had been placed, behind which sat Deacon Witt, his face a stern and unreadable mask. Beside him sat Constable Nathaniel Clark, a man whose authority was vested in a tarnished brass badge pinned to his coat. Nathaniel, a farmer whose duties rarely extended beyond settling property disputes, looked profoundly uncomfortable, his large, calloused hands resting on the table as if he were unsure what else to do with them. He kept his gaze fixed on the patterns in the wood grain, avoiding the accusing eyes of his neighbors. The accusations began with a raw and unscripted agony that silenced the entire room. The first to speak was the tenant farmer, Ada's father. He stood not at the front, but from his place in the crowd, his voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the tense silence. He did not speak of evidence or patterns. He spoke of his daughter. He described the worn woolen coat she had been wearing, the way she had carefully placed the eggs in her basket. He recounted his desperate, frantic search in the snow, his voice breaking as he described the sight of her small footprints ending at the foot of the widow's steps. A trail that led to an absolute and inexplicable nothingness. He said he had seen the truth in the snow that day, and that no denial could ever erase it. As he spoke, a collective moan of sorrow and anger rippled through the hall. He was followed by the cousin of the two orphan brothers, a man stooped with guilt and grief. He confessed that he had not looked for the boys with enough urgency. He said he had allowed himself to believe they had simply run off, because that was easier than believing the alternative. He said their absence was a weight on his soul, and that he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they had met their end at the tavern on the post road. His testimony was a plea for a forgiveness that no one in the room could grant. One by one, others added their fragments, stories of children seen, of strange encounters, of a pervasive sense of wrongness that had clung to the ransom property like a shroud. It was a litany of loss, a chaotic and emotional outpouring that laid the foundation of the case not in logic, but in the undeniable reality of a community's shared heartbreak. Into this maelstrom of grief, Josiah Brewer stepped forward, his presence a sudden injection of cold, methodical order. He walked to the front table and laid his private ledger upon it, its frayed pages a stark contrast to the official, leather-bound books of the parish. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the calm, dispassionate tone of a man reading a list of accounts, a delivery that made the content of his words all the more horrifying. He told the assembly that he had been keeping a private record. He explained that his duty as clerk was to record the history of the town, and that he had come to believe its most important and terrible chapter was going unwritten. He opened the ledger. He began with the name of Samuel Pike, the first child whose disappearance had caught his attention. For each name, he read the date they were last seen, their connection to the parish, and the witness accounts that placed them in the vicinity of Eunice Ransom's tavern. He read Ada's name, and the names of Thomas and Caleb. He read the names of 3 other children, transients and paupers, whose absence had barely been noted at the time. With each name, a fresh wave of shock and recognition passed through the crowd. The individual tragedies, which had felt isolated and distinct, were now being woven together into a single, monstrous pattern. Josiah's list gave the horror a structure, a timeline, a grim and undeniable arithmetic. He concluded his presentation by recounting, verbatim, the testimony of Nathan Holt, the ferryman. He spoke of the heavy, sealed barrels, the muffled cries, and the desperate scratching from within. When he finished, the whispering in the hall had ceased. The air was still and cold, thick with a silence that was heavier and more terrible than any sound. The full scope of the accusation now hung in the room, a palpable and sickening weight. It was at this moment that Eunice Ransom was called to answer. She had been made to wait in a small antechamber, and as the door opened, every eye in the hall turned toward her. She entered not as a frightened and cornered suspect, but with a chilling and unnatural composure. She was dressed in a severe, dark dress, her face as pale and emotionless as carved stone. She walked to the front of the hall, her steps measured and silent, and she stood before the table, a solitary figure of defiance against the collective judgment of the entire parish. She met the gaze of her accusers without flinching, her deep-set eyes betraying no hint of fear or guilt. Deacon Witt, his voice strained, asked her to respond to the testimony that had been given. He asked her if she had anything to say about the children who had vanished, about the barrels, about the riverboat traders. Eunice's denial was absolute. She said that the stories were the product of grief and morbid imagination. She stated that she was a poor widow, struggling to survive, and that her solitude had made her an easy target for the town's fears. She said that she did not know what had become of the children, and that it was cruel to lay their fate at her door. Then, with a calm and deliberate movement, she produced a small, oilskin-wrapped packet from the folds of her dress. She placed it on the table before the deacon. She told him that these were her business contracts. She explained that she had entered into an arrangement with a trading consortium based downriver. The contracts, she said, stipulated that she would act as a way station, storing their goods in her cellar in exchange for a small commission paid in the form of rum for her tavern. She claimed the barrels that had been seen contained not human cargo, but smuggled tobacco and furs, which the traders were moving at night to avoid the excisemen. The documents she produced were a masterful stroke of misdirection. They were written on heavy parchment. The ink faded in a way that suggested authenticity. They bore signatures and what appeared to be the official wax seals of a trading company. To the untrained eyes of Deacon Witt and Constable Clark, they looked legitimate. The contracts provided a plausible, if illicit, explanation for her dealings with the rivermen. They reframed her as a small player in a smuggling operation, a crime of commerce, not a crime against humanity. The accusation of murder, which had seemed so solid only moments before, was suddenly mired in the murky complexities of legal paperwork. Deacon Witt picked up one of the contracts, his brow furrowed. He was a man of the church, not a man of the law. He understood scripture and sin, but he was utterly out of his depth when it came to adjudicating the validity of a commercial document. Constable Clark, for his part, stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. The solid wall of community accusation had been breached. Doubt, like a thin, poisonous fog, began to seep into the room. Eunice had offered them an alternative narrative, a story that was sordid but comprehensible, illegal but not monstrous. For a community terrified of the truth, it was a tempting escape. The inquiry faltered. The righteous anger that had filled the hall began to dissipate, replaced by confusion and uncertainty. Deacon Witt, fearing a scandal that would bring shame and outside scrutiny upon his parish, seized upon the opportunity to de-escalate. He declared that the matter required further investigation. He said that the contracts would need to be verified, and that until such time, no judgment could be made. It was a classic bureaucratic maneuver, a deferral of justice masquerading as due process. The meeting dissolved not with a verdict, but with a weary and dissatisfied muttering. The parents of the lost children were left with their grief, their accusations now buried under a pile of dubious paperwork. Justice had not been done. It had been postponed indefinitely. Eunice Ransom walked from the meeting hall as she had entered, alone and composed, a widow shielded by the very system that was meant to expose her, her dark secret preserved, for now, by the quiet corruption of a community's fear of itself. The failed inquiry left the community suspended in a state of agitated paralysis. The official channels of justice had proven to be a dead end, clogged by bureaucratic timidity and the bewildering artifice of Eunice Ransom's contracts. Deacon Witt, having successfully avoided a public scandal, now actively discouraged any further discussion of the matter, urging his flock to place their faith in Providence and the slow, grinding wheels of a proper investigation that he had no intention of pursuing. But the truth, once glimpsed, could not be so easily unseen. A silent schism developed within the parish. On one side were those who clung to the deacon's counsel, eager to restore the fragile peace and to believe that the monstrous accusations were nothing more than a tragic misunderstanding. On the other were those, led by a grimly determined Josiah Brewer, who knew that justice had not been served, but merely deferred. They watched the widow's tavern with a renewed and fearful vigilance, convinced that the facade of normalcy she projected was a thin veneer over an abyss of unimaginable horror. They were a town holding its breath, waiting for the land itself, or God, to render a judgment that men had been too weak to deliver. The judgment came not in the form of a magistrate's decree, but as a violent, elemental fury that tore through the valley 3 weeks after the parish meeting. A late spring storm, born of a freakish collision of warm southern air and a stubborn pocket of Arctic cold, descended upon the region with the ferocity of a biblical plague. For 2 days and 2 nights, the sky was a bruised and churning canvas of black clouds, and the rain fell in solid, wind-driven sheets that turned the thawing fields into a vast, shallow lake and the post road into an impassable river of mud. The river, already swollen with melted snow, surged over its banks, its roar a constant menacing presence. It was a storm that seemed intent on washing the world clean, on scouring the landscape of its secrets and sins. On the second night, at the storm's violent apex, a sound like the cracking of a giant's bone echoed from the direction of the Ransom Tavern. It was a low, groaning report, followed by a prolonged, wet, tearing sound, and then a heavy, final thud that was felt as much as it was heard, a deep vibration that traveled through the saturated earth. The next morning, as a weak, watery sun broke through the retreating clouds, the reason for the sound was made horrifically clear. The relentless deluge of water had undermined the tavern's foundations. The rear wall of the building, the one that abutted the earthen bank leading down to the river, had given way. A significant portion of the tavern's fieldstone cellar lay exposed to the daylight, a gaping wound in the side of the house, a chaotic jumble of collapsed earth, splintered timbers, and shattered stone. It was this collapse that finally and irrevocably stripped away Eunice Ransom's veil of denial. The initial discovery was made by 2 men who had been checking on their livestock after the storm. Drawn by the sight of the tavern's ruined wall, they approached with a caution born of a deep and abiding fear of the place. What they saw in the churned mud and debris of the landslide stopped them cold. Partially buried in the wet, red clay was a small leather shoe, its buckle crusted with verdigris, its shape and size undeniably that of a young child. A few feet away, snagged on the splintered end of a floor joist, was a scrap of faded blue calico cloth, the remnant of a girl's dress. The earth, in its violent upheaval, had begun to give up the tavern's secrets. It was as if the very ground, unable to bear the weight of the atrocities committed upon it, had torn itself open in a desperate act of confession. The men did not touch anything. They turned and ran, their faces masks of pale horror, to fetch Josiah Brewer and the new parish reverend, a young and earnest man named Caleb Winslow, who had recently replaced the aging and increasingly ineffectual minister. They knew that what lay in that cellar required a different kind of authority, the meticulous documentation of a clerk and the moral witness of a man of God. Josiah Brewer arrived with his ledger under his arm, his face grim but his movements imbued with a sense of solemn purpose. He seemed prepared for what he was about to find, as if this physical confirmation was merely the final, predictable chapter in a story he had already written in his mind. He and Reverend Winslow, accompanied by a small, silent group of neighbors, descended into the ruined cellar. The air that rose to meet them was a sickening and complex miasma, an unholy trinity of odors. There was the damp, clean scent of the freshly turned earth, the cloying, sweet smell of spilled rum that seemed to have saturated the very stones of the foundation, and something else beneath it, a faint but pervasive odor of corruption, a smell of organic decay that was both sour and vaguely sweet. The interior of the cellar was a scene of utter devastation. Lantern light cast long, dancing shadows across the chaos, glinting off the wet surfaces of the exposed earth and the remaining fieldstone walls. Several of the large rum casks, the ones that had been the subject of so much speculation, had been broken open by the collapse. Their staves were shattered, their contents spilled across the dirt floor, creating a dark, viscous pool that reflected the wavering lantern light. It was in this pool, and within the splintered remains of the barrels, that the full, unutterable truth was revealed. Josiah, holding his lantern high, stepped closer, his boots sinking into the rum-soaked mud. He knelt, his face a study in controlled forensic detachment. Floating in the dark liquid, pale and stark against the mahogany brown of the rum, were bones. They were small, delicate, and unmistakably human. The vertebrae of a small spine, still articulated, lay curled like a fossilized serpent. The fragile, bird-like bones of a child's hand rested near a shattered barrel stave. In another broken cask, the perfectly preserved cranium of a young child stared up from the murky depths, its eye sockets two dark, empty O's of silent accusation. The rum, a powerful preservative, had done its work with a grotesque and terrible efficiency, preserving the remains of Eunice Ransom's victims in a state of arrested decay. Reverend Winslow, a man whose faith had been built on the abstract concepts of good and evil, let out a choked cry and turned away, his body racked with violent, silent retching. The other men stood frozen, their faces illuminated by the lantern light, their expressions a mixture of horror, rage, and a profound, soul-deep sorrow. They were standing not in a cellar, but in a tomb, a mass grave for the forgotten children of the parish. Josiah Brewer, his hand steady despite the scene before him, opened his ledger. He began to document what he saw, his quill scratching in the oppressive silence. He recorded the number of broken casks. He noted the visible remains, describing their condition with a clinical, almost unnerving precision. He wrote that the liquid in which the bodies were sealed was, by its strong and unmistakable odor, Caribbean rum. The question of how many children had met their fate in this place hung in the foul air, a silent, terrible interrogative. Based on the number of barrels, both broken and intact, that remained in the cellar, Josiah made a final, chilling entry. He wrote that it was his considered belief that the cellar contained the remains of no fewer than 12 individuals, all of them, by the size and nature of the bones, children. The title, the dark and whispered accusation that had been leveled against the widow, was now a proven and documented fact. Eunice Ransom had traded children for rum, but the final horrifying truth was that the children had become the rum, their small bodies the gruesome cargo in a transaction of unimaginable depravity. Community outrage, so recently dampened by official denial, now ignited into an inferno. But as the men climbed out of that dark, stinking hole and into the clean light of day, they saw that the tavern was empty. The front door stood ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Eunice Ransom was gone. She had not waited for their discovery, for their justice. Under the cover of the storm's chaos, she had slipped away, escaping the judgment of men, at least for a time, and leaving behind only the undeniable, horrific evidence of her crimes sealed in the cellar that had become her ledger of death. The discovery in the cellar broke the dam of the community's restraint. The carefully constructed walls of denial, so diligently maintained by Deacon Witt, were washed away in a torrent of collective rage and horror. Yet, the object of this righteous fury was gone. Eunice Ransom had vanished as completely as the morning mist on the river. She had used the chaos of the great storm as her cover, slipping out of the tavern in the dead of night while the wind howled and the rain lashed down. A final, spectral departure from the stage of her atrocities. Her flight was an act of profound and chilling calculation. She had understood that the storm which was undermining her foundation was also her salvation, a perfect cloak for an escape. There was no pursuit. The roads were impassable, the river a raging, debris-choked torrent. By the time Constable Nathaniel Clark could have organized a posse, she was long gone, swallowed by the wider world. Rumors, the last resort of a community denied a conclusion, became the only epitaph for her presence. Some said she had a prearranged rendezvous with the riverboat trader, Elias Cord, and was now hidden among the rootless, transient population of the downriver ports, her identity shed as easily as a snake's skin. Others whispered a darker, more fitting end, that she had tried to cross the flooded river in a small skiff and been claimed by the same black water that had been her accomplice, her body carried out to the indifferent sea. But there was no proof, no body, no final accounting. She simply ceased to be, leaving behind a vacuum filled with ghosts and the suffocating weight of unanswered questions. In the absence of a body to punish, the town turned its fury upon the place where she had lived and worked. The tavern, with its gaping wound and its cellar full of horrors, was no longer a building. It was a monument to their collective failure, a source of profound and unbearable shame. They could not abide its presence. Under the solemn direction of Reverend Caleb Winslow, a party of men was assembled. They did not approach the task with the efficiency of a demolition crew, but with the grim purpose of a ritual of exorcism. Before they began, the Reverend stood before the ruined structure and offered a long, impassioned prayer, not for the soul of the departed widow, but for the souls of the children she had taken, and for the cleansing of the land itself, which they believed had been corrupted by her presence. Then the work began. They dismantled the tavern piece by piece. They used heavy chains and oxen to pull down the remaining walls, the groaning of the timbers like the final death cries of a great beast. The wood, which they deemed to be tainted, was not salvaged for firewood or construction. It was piled into a massive pyre in the center of the muddy yard and set ablaze. The fire burned for a full day and night, a towering column of smoke that could be seen from miles away, a signal to the heavens and to all who watched that the community was attempting to purify itself, to cauterize the wound that Eunice Ransom had inflicted upon it. They worked in a determined, almost monastic silence, their faces grim and set, their movements fueled by a shared, unspoken need to erase the physical evidence of the crime that had unfolded in their midst. When the structure was gone, only the fieldstone foundation and the dark, open square of the cellar remained, a permanent scar on the earth. This they could not so easily remove. It became a site of quarantine, a place set apart from the normal rhythms of life. The families of the lost children, in an act of communal mourning, came and hammered crude wooden crosses into the ground around the perimeter of the foundation, each one a silent testament to a stolen life. These simple markers, weathered by the sun and rain, transformed the ruins into an unofficial cemetery, a place of profound and sorrowful sanctity. It became a taboo location. Parents began to use the story of the Rum Widow as a cautionary tale, a way to enforce obedience and to keep their children from wandering too close to the riverbank. They were told never to play near the old foundation stones, that the ground was soured by evil, that the ghosts of the murdered children still lingered there, trapped between worlds. The name Eunice Ransom was rarely spoken aloud. To say it was to risk invoking her spirit. Instead, she was referred to simply as the widow, or, in the hushed, frightened tones of folklore, the rum widow of the river. The person was gone, but the legend had begun to put down roots, nourished by the community's fear and its unexpiated guilt. The crime was so immense, and the failure of justice so complete, that the story could not be allowed to die. It had to be transformed into something else, a ghost story, a permanent feature of the valley's psychological landscape. For generations, the legend endured, evolving and taking on the patina of myth. The sharp, factual edges of the historical event were worn smooth by time and countless retellings around winter hearths. The story became less about the specific crimes of a desperate woman and more about a timeless, elemental evil that resided in the land itself. Travelers on the post road, unaware of the history of the place, would report strange and unsettling experiences as they passed the crumbling foundation stones, which were slowly being reclaimed by weeds and wild sumac. They spoke of a sudden, inexplicable chill in the air, even on the warmest of summer nights. Many claimed to have caught the distinct, sweet smell of spilt rum, an odor that had no natural source in the empty fields. The most common and disturbing account was the sound, carried on the river wind, of children crying. It was described as a faint, ethereal sobbing, a chorus of disembodied grief that seemed to rise from the very stones of the foundation. Sometimes, on nights when the moon was full, casting a pale skeletal light over the landscape, a few claimed to have seen a figure, a thin, gaunt woman in a dark dress, standing motionless among the ruins, a spectral guardian of her own terrible legacy. The site became a place that even the most hardened and skeptical of men would avoid after dark. The ruins of the tavern were her true and final tombstone, and her guilt, never judged in a court of law, lingered in the land itself, a permanent stain on the local consciousness. In the early 1900s, a folklorist from Boston, a woman named Abigail Marsh, traveled through the Connecticut River Valley, collecting the oral histories and ghost stories of the region. In her published journals, she dedicated an entire chapter to the legend of the Rum Widow. Abigail, with her scholarly and methodical approach, was one of the first outsiders to recognize the story, not merely as a quaint piece of rural superstition, but as a form of cultural memory, a way for a community to process a trauma that it had never fully resolved. She interviewed the great-grandchildren of the witnesses, people who had heard the story from their grandparents, who in turn had heard it from the men and women who had stood in the town hall and accused Eunice to her face. Abigail noted how the details had shifted over the years, how the number of victims varied with each telling, how the widow's motivations had been simplified into a form of pure, motiveless malignancy. But the core of the story, the terrible barter of children for rum, remained intact, a testament to its enduring power. She visited the ruins herself, describing the crumbling foundation stones, the cluster of rotted wooden crosses, and the profound sense of desolation that permeated the air. She wrote that she did not hear the cries or smell the phantom rum, but that she did experience a powerful and oppressive sense of sorrow, a feeling that the ground beneath her feet was saturated with an unforgivable history. Her final reflection on the matter was a question that echoed the one the community had been asking itself for nearly a century. Had Eunice Ransom truly escaped down the river, or had a part of her remained, inextricably bound to the site of her crimes? The folklore, Abigail concluded, was the community's answer. Because legal justice had never arrived, the people of the valley had been forced to create their own. They had cursed Eunice Ransom with a form of immortality, binding her memory to the land forever, ensuring that she would be eternally defined by her monstrous title, the widow who traded children for rum. Her true fate remains a mystery, a blank page in the historical record, but her legend became her sentence, an eternal haunting that served as a grim reminder that some crimes are so profound they can never be truly buried, and some ghosts are simply the echoes of a justice that was never served. The record on Eunice Ransom is now sealed. Your presence here, as we turn the final haunted page, has given voice to the forgotten. If you are new to this archive, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to be among the first when the next file is opened, and share your thoughts in the comments on the justice that was never found.